So, go on, what she like? She got nice tits? I like a girl with big hooters. Gives you something to grab onto, if you know what I mean. I picked this chick up in a bar once who had the biggest pair of fun bags you've ever seen in your life. They were fucking amazing, you know? I could've... Hey, Sakuma!
I fucking love anime, dude. This year's OVA month was a kind of a two-parter. The first half was spent doing a bunch of research for a long-ass project that's gonna materialize at some point in the future, but I'm afraid to jinx it by going further. Rest assured, the research didn't really feel like OVA month, even though I was blazing through multiple anime at a time. And then there was the other half, which was a mixed bag to say the least. I saw the almost entirely mid The Boy Who Saw the Wind, which is a floaty piece of bargain bin Ghibli worship with serviceable politics and a muddled structure. It's not great, it's not terrible, but if the scenes I'm showing here aren't immediately capturing your interest, I'd say just skip it. There are plenty more interesting OVAs to check out on YouTube alone. After that, I checked out the Grubbler Baki OVA Ultimate Fighter, which does showcase some of the core strengths of the series, but is truly hampered by the runtime. Baki to me is a series of just the most bonkers shonen shit you've ever seen, including, but not limited to, spontaneously inventing a whole martial arts for cut hands, vomiting up a grenade as an emergency escape from a losing fight, and sculpting stone with your bare hands. Compared to those later story highlights, Ultimate Fighter just doesn't have the swag. Like, sure, nerve destruction is pretty cool, but is it anywhere as cool as getting your ass handed to you by a gigantic praying mantis you just made up? No. Not really, but at least Ultimate Fighter has one of the most legendary anime faces going for it, which counts for something. To really drive home how dire things got, even something as visually striking as Goku Midnight Eye just couldn't get past the filter this year. Like, yeah, it's got the aesthetic, the one that all the synthwave artists have been trying to pass as the 80s since Hotline Miami dropped, but it's a little too greasy and male power fantasy-y for my tastes. Like, the first half is pretty good. I dig the whole Akira meets hardboiled detective vibe it's got going on, but I checked out heavy by the time it dropped the pretense and just became a B-tier superhero story. I really wanted to be on its side though, since the director Yoshiaki Kawajiri is behind one of my all-time favorite movies, but this just wasn't it. I even checked out the sequel to see what's up, and while it had more of a coherent plot, its arms hairy, themes weak, misogyny steady, mom spaghetti... Hey, wasn't this supposed to be a year-end highlight vid?
Golgo 13, Queen Bee.
For those who don't know anything about Golgo 13, it's a whole institution in the Japanese media landscape. Just to name two of its immense accolades, it's the longest running manga of all time, having started its run in 1968, and the first OVA, Golgo 13 The Professional, was the first notable OVA to experiment with CGI. Look at them go, Skunk City. This was my first Golgo 13. I've been meaning to get into the series for years at this point, and I've consumed so much discussion about The Professional that it feels like I've seen it by osmosis, which, as we all know, is the homeopathy of art. You might get the faintest whiff of the thing, but remain lacking and sick. Especially when it comes to stuff like Golgo 13, that you really need to smoke like a thick Cuban cigar in the pouring rain. You just can't cut this shit, it's too strong. Golgo 13 is the story of Duke Togo, the best assassin ever. You don't really need to know more than that. Everything about the series is included in that one sentence synopsis. What else do you need? To compensate for his sheer godlike professionalism, the tone of the series is as big and operatic as he is. Queen Bee has him going up against an adversary of equal professionalism. The titular Queen Bee is a drug smuggler aiming to take out a presidential candidate whose anti-drug policies are endangering her whole operation. And by anti-drug policies, I of course mean that his campaign manager hires Duke Togo to fix this issue. If there's one thing politicians love more than anything, it's extrajudicial killing. Things get a little bit more complicated when it turns out that Queen Bee is also vying for a deal with Duke, which in the professional world is known as a conflict of interests. To see how he'll execute this tall task, you'll just have to watch the OVA.
Nemesis.
Let's start this section off with something fun and by commemorating Albert Puyn, who passed away last year. Now, I'm not going to try and pretend like I'm the biggest Puyn understander there is. Nemesis here was the first movie I've seen from him, but I'll leave some good resources in the description to get a better understanding of his style and works. What I am going to say is that he's an absolute legend of the low-budget genre cinema canon, and that is on full display in Nemesis. I was meaning to go a little bit more into this in my video The Lo-Fi Beauty of Shoestring Horror, but what I find so irresistible about low-budget movies like this is the ingenuity on display. There's so much consideration that goes into the planning and executing a movie like Nemesis that it couldn't be anything else than a work of flaming passion. Seeing something like the legendary motel gunfight or some of the special effects towards the end make me so hyped, especially when considering that all of this is achieved with just hair over $2 million. Like, that's just crazy. I think the core that makes most of these low-budget movies so endlessly fascinating is how that lack of money really makes the filmmaker focus on what they feel is important. There's the old truism of limitation being a friend of art, which, kind of agree, kind of disagree, but there is something to be said about how it forces an artist to zero in on their priorities, and in the best cases make something more special because of that love. With a smaller budget, the things that really matter don't get lost in the noise or chewed up by the production machine. To me, this often can be seen the best in movies with a ton of practical effects because they feel this limitation the most and have to just really commit to something after it's done. The weird part about Nemesis then is that those rough edges don't really show at all. This is just glorious from top to bottom on that department. I know it's a basic bitch thing to say, but there really aren't that many things that can top something like this.
Star Trek.
This was the year I finally got into Star Trek. My fiancé started showing me The Next Generation to me as a project to fill in some major cultural gaps, and I'm kind of angry at myself for taking so long. For years, my glib answer to the whole Star Trek versus Star Wars question was to say,
Riddick.
which is still true, but I can't front. Star Trek won me over big time. I think TNG's biggest strength lies in the episodic structure. There's probably a whole discourse about episodic versus serial TV, and guys, we can have both, but I'm just constantly amazed by the sheer craft of these episodes. I really admire the apparent simplicity of weaving these character-focused narrative strands around a general thematic core that's often pretty thought-provoking even to this day. If you're curious, my favorite episode so far is Tin Man because it navigates the themes of othering, hyper-empathy, and true connection beyond the human-non-human divide so delicately. Really helps that GOM 2 is such an incredible design as well. Peak TV right there. With all of that said, this entry isn't about Star Trek The Next Generation. It's about J.J. Abrams' Star Trek from 2009.
In my time, where I come from, this is a simple mining vessel. I chose a life of honest labor. Provide for myself and the wife who was expecting my child. I was off-planet, doing my job while your Federation did nothing, and allowed my people to burn while our planet broke in half. And Spock, he didn't help us. He betrayed us.
No, you're confused. You've been misinformed. Romulus hasn't been destroyed. It's out there right now. You're blaming the Federation for something that hasn't happened.
A bit of a different vibe here, right? Well, I'll start off by saying the obvious. This is not a good Star Trek movie, at least for me. Of course there's room in the greater Star Trek canon for this sort of interpretation. Mind you, my only touchpoint so far is TNG. But the whole thing that got me into Star Trek is the feeling of domesticity, the diplomacy, and the calmness of the process that then usually gets pretty effectively contrasted against the seriousness of the situation. J.J. Abrams' vision of Star Trek is so breathlessly kinetic that it would be almost impossible to imagine someone stopping for tea or dealing with themes of, say, losing competence to aging. It's a more generic version of sci-fi that is by and large detrimental to the soul of the story. Especially the scene near the opening where Kirk gets recruited had me squirming because the tonal shift made the whole thing seem like a generic sergeant grooming cannon fodder scene that made me question the fundamentals of Starfleet. This is not an improvement. But, and this is a planet-sized but, if you divorce a movie from the source material and watch it as its own thing, it abso-fucking-lutely owns. The movie is relentless in the action set pieces, which are paced with near perfection. There are so many highlights here, mostly just because the scenes are so well thought out. They present interesting problems that then get solved in logical ways that aren't just the generic approaches one would take in a Hollywood production. The whole thing feels like a fun conversation with a filmmaker at their prime, guiding your attention, laying out the stakes, and setting the mood in a way that demonstrates how much you can achieve with the film language of Hollywood action alone. Like, yeah, the plot isn't all that interesting when you zoom out, but why the hell would you? It's a movie that's enjoyed in the moment-to-moment action that sucks you right in and doesn't let go until the movie is done. So, let's recap. Is this a good Star Trek movie? Absolutely not. Is it a good story? Not really, it's pretty generic all told. Is it a good movie though? Yes. Yes it is.
Galaxy Quest.
Spoofs are a rat king of catch-22 choices. Just the initial question of who's my core audience, the fans or the haters, is such a minefield that if I were tasked with figuring that out, I would just quit on the spot. Like, yeah, sure, you can say that it's always better to do things out of love, and the best parodies come from people who actually understand the material, but is it? First off, to make something for an existing audience already assumes some level of familiarity with the source material, which can be alienating for major audiences, and naturally assumes the same from the creators themselves, creating a lot of homework in the pre-production stage. Secondly, who wants a parody more? People who love the thing, or people who don't? Dunking can be such a cathartic experience, which is why there's such a massive market for it. And in a capitalist society, it mostly comes down to that question. Who has the deeper pockets? The fans or the haters? Well, Galaxy Quest was released in 1999 with a pretty nice budget, doubling $90 million in international box office returns. Scary Movie, a movie of infinitely less worth, released a year later, raked in $278 million, had 4 sequels, basically manufactured the whole cultural moment, and had so many spin-offs that they count as their own genre.
Okay, so this sucks.
Just to clarify, Galaxy Quest isn't some obscure small fry either. It's a spoof on one of the biggest sci-fi franchises of all time, with a leading cast consisting of Alan Rickman, Tim Allen, and Sigourney Weaver, and like, what else do you need? The approval of the original crew of Star Trek? Well, they got that too. Even my not having seen the original show looking ass can attest how good of a parody this is. Or better yet, how good of a sci-fi movie it is. Just look at this pig lizard. Look at him. I love him. When he showed up, I became so happy I almost started speaking in tongues. Or, if that's not up to your speed, look at the Fatu Cray and their ship. They didn't need to go this hard. I love the weird dragon insect thing they got going on with the green tinted concrete and industrial pipes. It's just so delightful. And so is the story. I'm gonna be opaque about it on purpose because I think the hook is going to be a lot funnier if I don't spoil it outright, but I would like to touch on some of the themes going on because I think they're fascinatingly weird. At the sort of heart of the story is this spaceship, right? And the spaceship is built by a convoluted process of backwards engineering from a fictional ship, the joke being that this is an absurd, wasteful, and fully untenable thing to even do, but yet it somehow works. It's a meta joke that plays on the audience's suspension of belief, daring it to break, but pushing through regardless. And to me, you can approach that from a couple of different fun angles. First is as a takedown of one of the quintessential narratives of sci-fi, its predictive power. I think all of us have heard this before, how some author invented the modern internet in a book that was released in the 70s, like, oh, spooky. But, like, that's sort of silly, right? Not only is the process so much more complicated, but as the joke points out, to construct something out of a piece of fiction instead of letting the process unfold naturally is just absurd on its face. Or is it? If we take a step or two outside of the confines of the accepted philosophical frameworks, we can start to get into some trippier conversations that might suggest otherwise. Hyperstation is a philosophy term coined by the Marxist cultural theorist Mark Fisher and the self-professed hyper-racist Nick Land. If that sounds like a contradiction in terms, it is, but the super condensed version is that the two used to work in a far-left cultural research group called the CCRU that was sketching out weird Deleuzian philosophy about snake becoming, negative feedback loops, AI beyond time, alternative timeline malaise, and the constriction of imagination until Nick Land went on a trip to China, took too many drugs, had a mental breakdown, and became a supervillain. Anyways, Hyperstation. Hyperstation is one of those concepts that's slightly unintuitive to understand, but let's have a crack at it. I will be citing this video by not actually, because it's the best explanation I've come across so far. So, Hyperstation is essentially superstition, but where superstition is a fiction that can't become reality, Hyperstation can. Like, no matter how much you believe that Friday 13th is an unlucky day, there's no statistical backing for that belief. Belief in superstition might alter the perception of the believer, but it doesn't actualize in reality. But hyperstation is a belief that wills itself into being. Funnily enough, the example used in Not Actually's video is space travel because it's a thing that didn't exist for several millennia outside of humanity's stories until it did. Or, in other words, the builders of the spaceship believed in this specific construct so deeply it willed itself into existence. Which, coincidentally, is the same way the orc technology works in 40k. Funny how parallels like this show up when you move in the murkier waters of analysis. I think we live in a funny part of history where the temporal removal and subsequent normalization of space stuff has gone so far that the idea that you simply couldn't, even as a bird or other non-human entity, go to space seems alien. Like, of course you can do it, but for most of history, you simply couldn't. And for pretty much everything that's not a human or in the hands of humanity, that's still the case. No animal travels to space. That's a distortion in reality brought on by the will of humanity. Now, these two interpretations are wildly contradictory, and I won't even attempt to synthesize them in any way, but I thought it would be fun to explore them a little bit. I don't rep a lot of comedies on this channel because I rarely have anything all too interesting to say about them, but this, as you can see, is an exception. Galaxy Quest is a great one.
Legend.
This was probably the most divided I was on a movie all year. It's by some accounts the final part of Ridley Scott's incredible 3-movie run consisting of Alien, Blade Runner, and of course, Legend. It's a real showcase of Ridley Scott's incredible filmmaking prowess, putting his eye for striking images and intuitive understanding of poppy narrative flow front and center. And what a lavish affair it is. Every shot has something spectacular going on, be it one of the award-winning special effects, a top-notch high fantasy landscape that was physically built in the Pinewood Studios, or those incredible aerials that give Legend a truly magical feeling. I especially love the bubble set against the snowy scenery in Gump's introductory scene. It's such an option C choice, like I don't think anyone else would have put these two things together. And if it was just up to the aesthetics, Legend would be on top of this list easily. The sheer peak era Hollywood extravaganza they were able to pull off here is nothing but exceptional. It made me think about how often the general form of sci-fi and fantasy mirror each other in terms of starkness and excess, sci-fi being semiotically tied to the vast emptiness of space and the neatness of functional design, while fantasy grows in all directions like a thick coat of vines. This binary is of course somewhat bullshit because no genre can be reduced like this, but you know, the vibes are there. The problem with Legend comes when we move beyond the surface though. Especially the acting gets so saccharine that it kind of turned revolting. Like, I don't know what it is, like it's this exact opposite of abjection, but it has the same effect, like the same feeling. Every time the camera lingered on Tom Cruise's dumb whimsy grin, I just wanted to leave the room. There's something deep within me that just can't handle this shit. Kind of personally fascinating, honestly, but that hang-up almost killed the whole movie for me. Even beyond that, there are some other slight things I didn't particularly like. One of the more major ones, even if an explainable one, is that there's a weird contradiction between the modes of storytelling here. It tries to find a balance between that classic storybook detachment, where characters are allowed to be more like symbols than embodied characters, but the Hollywood-isms inherent to the movie's style still seem to ask us to use them as our way into the story. Like, you really feel that there's a missing character arc somewhere in the DNA of the movie, but even as the movie closes, there isn't a meaningful change in any of the characters. The director's cut we watched attempts to add some depth by making Lily a more complicated character, turning her obliviousness into this major fault, even to a morally questionable degree, but the idea is more interesting on paper than in action. I do think Legend deserves its place here for the simple fact that for me, the highest peak of high fantasy is to see Mortis kill a unicorn while a torrential rain of cherry blossoms fills every inch of the screen. I could watch this on loop for hours.
After Sun.
After Sun was a huge 180-degree turn for me. I went to see it with my brother because we happened to have a day off at the same time, and I walked in without knowing a single thing about it. I didn't know about the nominations, the prizes, the critical appraisal, nothing. Didn't even know the genre really, but I'm pretty omnivorous when it comes to movies, so whatever. After Sun is another one of those much discussed European art movies where, quote, nothing happens, and yeah, I was sort of frustrated for the first 15 minutes or so. But then, something magical happened. It started to click into place. While the performances are genuinely incredible, I think the real MVPs are the camera and the editing that felt like they were constantly building up towards some catastrophic match cut that would bring all those mundane intimacies to a catastrophic halt. As soon as you catch on to those vibes, some of those camera movements start to feel like a wistful trumpet just trailing off to the void. After Sun isn't a hidden gem by any means. As I mentioned, it got a slew of nominations and a couple of wins in prestigious film festivals around the world, so it doesn't really need me championing it any further, but like, how could I not? It's so good it quickly became the movie I would measure every other drama against this year. Unlike a lot of other movies that operate on a similar level of sparseness, After Sun is a surprisingly digestible movie that encourages the audience to reflect on the artistic choices at play, which also makes it a wonderful piece to learn how to watch other, maybe more challenging movies on a similar wavelength. A poem that reveals how language works type deal. It's marvelous.
The Eight Mountains.
When Cineflect called this movie
the first masterpiece of 2023,
I couldn't agree more. I would have completely missed one of the year's best new movies if it wasn't for my fiance's obsession with this little talk Netflix action movie, The Old Guard, and its cast. The connection here is Luca Marinelli, a brilliant Italian actor who plays Pietro, an estranged son of a mountain-loving, car-dying, cabin commissioning dad seeking to reconnect with his childhood friend Bruno, who still lives in the mountains they used to spend their summers in. The Eight Mountains is a touching movie on so many different levels. Much like After Sun, it's more of a meditation on its themes of family, friendship, and heritage than a classic drama with a flowing plotline, but where After Sun approached its meditation as a lyrically dissociating experience of summer holidays just passing by, The Eight Mountains is way more concrete. It embraces the awesomeness of life that's externalized in the breathtaking mountain vistas and the physical labor that comes from building a cabin that would overlook the beauty of its valleys. There's emotionally complicated downslope skiing, hardcore stone parkour, and fresh dips into the clearest mountain lake captured on film. The only thing that's more tangible than the physical world in the Eight Mountains is the emotional core at the center of it. The movie hits a height where the air gets thinner and the world looks beautiful again. It's an emotionally mature story about how human relationships, be they familial or friendly or somewhere in between, can be difficult, but always worth it and worth the care. It somehow manages to hit that perfect chord between deeply personal and almost fully universal, while not sacrificing the depth of its characters. To modify an old meme a bit, the experience of the Eight Mountains is to climb the highest mountain and see the face of a friend.
Kings of the World.
The Kings of the World was my favorite watch of this year's Helsinki International Film Festival. It's an exceptionally beautiful movie about a group of boys on their way to reclaim a plot of land owned by the main character Ra's grandparents. As you can glean from that synopsis, it's essentially a coming-of-an-age road movie, but it's suffused with this intimate, poetic, and fable-like atmosphere communicated by the gorgeous shots and the willingness to just let the scenes breathe. It's just extremely confident filmmaking. Nothing quite left me with a similar sense of phantom pain as this movie did. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Ustedes dos cargas con los muchachos como si fueran hijos tuyos. Sí, bien. Ellos son mi familia.
Magic Mike's Last Dance.
Remember last year when I said that we went to see Belle as our Valentine's movie? Well, this year we saw this. The vibe's a little different, huh? No, I haven't seen any of the other Magic Mike movies, but this one took me by storm. I know the series has a reputation of being more than meets the eye, but I was not prepared to be this engaged. And the thing is, I don't even think Channing Tatum is hot.
Would it be a problem if I was?
No, this is 100% business.
So let's start with the story. We kick off with Mike working as a catering company's barkeep. He's approached by Maxandra Mendoza, a current mid-divorce upper-class socialite who tempts Mike to do one last show for her. But before we get to the show must go on up in here, this whole thing turns out to be a very complicated way for Maxandra to get back at her soon ex-husband. After this realization, things get real complicated, endangering the show in the process. What lands Magic Mike's Last Dance on the year-end list though, is that it's such an incredible pro-art piece of work. It makes an emotionally compelling case for sticking with it even through adversity. And I think more importantly, even when it's something as lowbrow as a strip show, it lays out how much vision, coordination, and practice goes into putting on a good event, and how it would be foolish to brush off all that in the name of, I don't even know, keeping art pure or something idiotic like that. I'm sort of repeating what I said about biopics in the context of Spring and Chaos in last year's best of list, but I think far too many stories about art are about the great works or trying to make one. Like, I get why that is, it doesn't take a genius to crack that nut, but once again, that great man view of history is creeping from the sidelines, and I don't like that. If I got $1 every time I heard someone say that they can't make art because it won't be a masterpiece right out of the gate, I'd probably have enough money to take my fiancée to a nice meal in the coming Valentine. It's honestly kind of bewildering how making a generation-defining work has become the threshold to even start making something, when, let's be real, just the doing part is often a reward in and of itself. So let's raise a toast to sincerity, the craft of art, and to Magic Mike for reminding a member of the bourgeoisie that staying horny is worth more than money. I salute you, Magic Mike.
The Fast and the Furious, Red Line, Crash, triple feature.
This 2-day high-speed head-on collision was the reason I started the double feature series, and actually, by transitive property, I'll call this double features part 2. Cause why not? Let's have some fun here.
Here we go!
This all happened around the time Barbenheimer was really picking up steam on Twitter, and you know, not to be a snob, but from what I know, it's just not a good double feature. I'm sorry, it's just that opening on the same day isn't really a compelling reason to double feature something. They got no chemistry. It all comes down to the essayistic fun of double features I laid out in the first video of the series. Here, the three movies come together to make a thematic Icarus story about car culture. First, as a science fiction power fantasy of rebellion and the intoxication of going a million miles an hour. Then, as a slightly more grounded story about how legal forces mold both individuals and communities, built on the chassis of modern-day car fetishism and logistics infrastructure. The triple feature then concludes in the dark reflection of all of that, showing how even in traumatic injury, these machines still mold us to be ever more dependent on them, while also providing an unprecedented form of privacy that allows for all sorts of illicit activity out in the public. I think it's important to note how all three hold illegality as their primus motor, thematically speaking, as if the actual potential of cars isn't the simple pre-approved transportation of both people and goods. It's a stirring notion, especially if you're even somewhat aware of the environmental issues that come with personal cars, and the ways their designs have trended up to be more hostile towards pedestrians, or hell, just straight up more militarized. If you've never come to contact with the sociological fever dream that is the Rezvani vengeance, can I take the pleasure of popping your cherry?
Hey mamas, let's talk about the memorable features on the Rezvani vengeance. I'm body armored, and so is this vehicle. For even more protection, you have explosive underbody shielding, bulletproof glass, electrified door handles, military-grade run flat tires, and a ram steel bumper. If anyone's following you, you have blinding lights in the front and the back, or a smoke screen. Plus my favorite, pepper spray. If you're picking your kids up from the mall, let them know you're there with strobe lights and your intercom. Hey Bobby, it's your mommy. Your kids will love that it was styled by a video game designer.
But yeah, I think if you live in a society that cars are slowly suffocating, which, let's be real, is every society these days, see the climate issues, I couldn't recommend this triple feature higher. I feel that Titan would probably work as the proper capstone to this whole watching session, but I haven't seen it yet, so make your own judgments. Rest assured, you won't be seeing cars with the same eyes after you're done.
Morning Patrol.
Liminal heads, listen up. This movie is dedicated to you. Back when I was in film school, one of my friends came up with the term night drive movies, which are like a vibes-based category of movies that are best watched alone late at night. The intended effect is to be in a slightly dissociated mood, absorbing the atmosphere and the general gist of the movie rather than engaging it for enjoyment or analysis. To use it more as a background element, without a foreground to take your attention. You know, ambient sort of cinema. I think he came up with the term after seeing Brown Bunny for the first time like this, which he implied to be a sort of spiritual experience. I've been compelled by the idea ever since, and while I haven't seen Brown Bunny yet, I feel Morning Patrol gave me a similar experience. I watched it in chunks over the course of a week right before going to sleep, which, you know, might not be the most optimal way to watch any movie. I couldn't really explain the plot or themes of Morning Patrol even if I tried, but what can I say? The movie is on this list. That has to account for something.
Broken Embraces.
There was a season of Almodovar movies at our favorite theater this fall, which was pretty baller of them to do. Sadly, we only made it to one of the screenings, but boy was it a good one. Broken Embraces is a slight outlier in Almodovar's filmography. It switches out the usual bright, warm Mediterranean palette to something more brooding and toned down to tell a sad story about a blind rider recounting his life story up to this point. Almodovar isn't a stranger to the thriller formula, but in Broken Embraces, he really zeroes in on the brooding tension that often lies in his sprawling stories of complicated love, but one he rarely explores with this level of seriousness from what I've seen. The end result is a compelling, multi-layered story of double lives, metafiction, and a beautiful lost future. Broken Embraces is a lot straighter than most of his other movies, in both senses of the word, but even despite that, it rose to my top 5 Almodovars almost immediately. We had a long discussion about it on our way home with my fiancé, who wasn't as impressed as I was, but to me, it just opened up Almodovar in a new way that I appreciate a hell of a lot. It's still very much him rearranging his favorite modular storytelling pieces in his typically sprawling way, but shown from a different angle, in a different light. And I have to respect that. Great stuff.
Parallel mothers.
Oh, this is the best one. So, check out this opening scene. You have this photographer, right? Her name is Yanis, and she does a photo shoot with a forensic archaeologist named Arturo. After the shoot, they walk out, talking friendly and with great chemistry. She pitches him the idea of coming to her home village to document a mass grave that dates back to the Spanish Civil War. He's interested but wary because recently the government has been clamping down on the funding on these projects due to their taboo nature. Still, they decide to give it a go because, hey, you never know. After that, one thing leads to another and they end up... well, you can see what's going on here. Like in so many movies from our guy, this introductory storyline is then dropped almost completely, and it's slowly revealed that this is actually a very sapphic story between Yanis and Anna, another recent mother she meets at the maternal ward. After one of the babies dies of crib death, the two end up moving together to foster the one that survived. Parallel Mothers is a story about complex human relationships, Almodovar's forte, and he's at his career peak over here. But also, maybe more than any other time, the intro remains as a haunting presence that looms over the rest of the narratives and peeks through in moments where lines of intimacy get questioned. Parallel Mothers is a fascinating late evolution in Almodovar's career. He came up as a central figure of La Movida Madrileña, a countercultural moment in post-Franco Spain that embraced the freedoms that came after the death of fascism. Almodovar especially focused on the hedonistic side of those freedoms, oftentimes telling stories about two ships in the night that end up entwined in a super complicated way. He's a figure I keep thinking about every time the discourse about queer representation comes up because, like, he's been making dramas about fully realized gay characters that include trans people casually for decades now. And boy are they horny, and gorgeous, and interesting to talk about. They're just not Hollywood, which mostly means that they're not ever included in the conversation. Alas, such is the broader discussion. Well, anyways, to get back on track, for all of his socially progressive tendencies, throughout his career he's been quiet about the historical shadow looming over his home country. The only other mention of Franco in Almodovar's filmography is in the beginning of Live Flesh, where the opening scene takes place during the night Franco dies, and even there it's just mostly like a passing moment of texture rather than full acknowledgement of its effects. And you know, that's fine and all. No artist ever has to tackle a subject like this if they don't want to, but it is interesting to note because of the circumstances that led to the birth of La Movida. When discussing this topic in an interview for The Guardian, he talks about the way he always thought of his movies as apolitical because they were young and just kinda wanted to enjoy life. Looking back though, it's sort of a funny way to frame that thing. As the world once again seems to fall backwards into fascism, those themes of sexual liberation, especially for queer folk, are increasingly a source of controversy. The narratives surrounding the satanic panic of the 80s are being resurrected around the world as we speak, again laying it thick how good normal people aren't down with sexual deviancy or, well, recreational sex, both of which are big hitters in Almodovar movies. Not to say that there was a moment anywhere between now and then when these topics were an open discussion without any form of controversy, but it seems like the tensions rising and Almodovar's maturity as a person have finally brought him to a place where he chose to take a crucial look back at Spain's fascist past. While most of the screen time in Parallel Mothers is dedicated to the ever more complicated relationship between the two mothers, the strongest narrative thread going through it has to do with the legacy of Franco's reign. Fascinatingly, the movie almost seems to play as a dialogue between the two phases of Almodovar's career. The younger of the two, Anna, is a naive beneficiary of her parents' involvement in Francoist politics, but unwilling to confront them about it, whereas Yanis is literally organizing an excavation to witness the full scale of destruction in her childhood home. It's a heavy subject for sure, and as the final scene unfolded, I wept like a baby. And hey, even if you don't know anything about the Spanish Civil War, it is still an Almodovar banger you should not miss at any cost.